Hi, my name is FITZPATRICK, and I'm an up-and-coming artist active in the areas of Massachusetts and in Brooklyn. I'm studying at Pratt Institute right now, and right now I'm surrounded by a lot of friends, a lot of family, and a lot of people who are kind enough to wade through anything to make their way to the Montserrat Contemporary Art Gallery in Lower East Chelsea, no matter what, all throughout the month of February. It's an honor. We have picked 8 of my artworks, I want to say, that tell something of a story, coincidentally enough, I think, about a number of events in my life and a number of events that I think factor into a wider scheme of connected sameness throughout the world. And to explain what I mean about that, I think we're going to take this one at a time. This House of Cards was, I think, the first artwork that I've done several years ago that's really put me in the headspace of becoming a fine artist. This was done around the time of the 2016 elections when there was a lot of uncertainty. And my worldview, a lot different than it is today, was about the fragility of society as a whole as we know it. How there is a lower class that is very loosely kept together, almost like the structure of a house of cards, that supports the bigger, higher ups all the way here that are very stoic, very rigid, very well put together. But the society as a whole cannot collapse unless there is one thing that holds them together. Some sort of structure, some sort of respect, some sort of mutual agreement that the lower class and the higher class need to be structured together, need to be well. There needs to be some sort of cohesion and not a split, a direct schism in humanity, in between society, in between people, that causes people to become very fragile. This artwork generally represents the fear of the uncertainty of the future around the 2016 elections. Moving on, this artwork right here, Sands of Time, this one I did as an ode to my former faith as a former Catholic. And this was it was inspired by the idea of a karmic sort of system of justice that's preached in a lot of religions, a lot of world religions, that there is some essence that comes together over time that gives people some sort of justice, comeuppance, what have you, in a very spiritual manner. No matter what happens in life or in death, there is some sort of justice that kind of comes to people. That was the idea when I was a former, very devout, very practiced Catholic, and while the artwork still holds up remarkably well, I think that this artwork, it represents a change over time in my ideologies, in my worldviews, and my system, that perhaps this idea of religious justice is heavy-handed, it's bold, it's scary. And this character right here was one of the first times I was ever really morally conflicted about anything in the world. A real hanged figure that is in the hourglass, hanged through the sands once the sands pass, and then they are left for the gallows right here. A very disturbing dog-eat-dog worldview was what I was preached and what I was taught growing up. And at some point, I was simply not happy with that outlook on life anymore. So I changed for greener pastures. I tried considering alternate worldviews in my life and in the lives of others. For example, this piece right here, Wings of the Cosmos, very small piece about a very small bird, the average cardinal, perhaps the most straightforward bird you could imagine. Very predictable migration habits, very predictable biology, very predictable sort of mannerisms. But what we might consider quaint is still the life of this little bird that we find fascinating, that we find so many different little things about. And this bird, as a result of being so tiny, sees the world in such a larger headspace. There's a beauty to the worlds when you are very small and you can take flight and you can see anyone and anything. There's might be a little more simplistic, but in the average day-to-day life of a human per se that has a 9-to-5 job, it works, it goes places, it drives around, it has so many different things to balance. There is so many other experiences in the world that we don't take for granted that perhaps the average bird might, that any other life form might. This is just one experience out of millions, where the trees and the nests and the skies are a whole other world of planets and details and any other infinite amount of wonders that the bird might experience in the day-to-day life. And that gets so forgotten in the average human lifespan because of the way that life goes on, regimented, scheduled, instead of free, open, and in the air. This right here is a portrait of my older sister. This is a collage of her many operatic music pieces that she sings. Most notably among them was I Attempt from Love Sickness by the one and only Henry Purcell, which was a piece that she'd sung several times before. And as I was also trying to consider other worldviews, instead of the regimented society is broken, there is a thing to fear, we should instead experience the lives of others, whether it be something small and innocent, or something like a friend, or maybe a relative, maybe a sister, maybe someone else in the world. And I think that brings us to the middle piece right here, Guiding Hands. I did this around the time that I moved, and there was a lot of tension in my life. There was a lot of cohesion, a lot of uncertainty about where the path ahead was, and I'd question a lot of my beliefs. I'd question a lot of my challenges, and this piece represents how much I wanted to hold things together, almost. Of all the many overdone plaintive observations on life, life is like a river, life is like a box of chocolates. I think that the one that I want to roll with is that life is like holding water in your hands. It's very tough to do, and if you're not careful, a lot of it can slip out of your hands. In Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, there's the allegory of the man who wants to travel around the mansion with the spoon of oil in his spoon. And he cannot focus on all the many things in the mansion without spilling what's in the spoon. But at the same time, if he only focuses on the spoon, he's going to miss the several different wonderful objects, paintings, sculptures, whatsoever in the mansion. So it's a balance in life constantly between holding yourself easily, but at the same time, holding the water of those you consider dear and near in a way that it can develop, it can prosper, it can grow into a community of whatever it is that you might choose. Whatever it is that you hold dear, you must hold it tight and not spill it out over the edge and not let it slip through your fingertips. It's been a long-standing philosophy of mine that the important things in life are to be cherished, held tightly, and held dearly. With this new altered worldview of there is no spiritual justice, there is just what you could hold in your hands together, this brings us to the final three pieces. This one, Astronaut Artemis, was completed in the middle of the 2020 pandemic. Right around the time, NASA had announced a serious space mission, Project Artemis, to land the first ever the first ever woman and the first ever person of color onto the moon, specifically the lunar South Pole, in what was eventually delayed to 2025. There's a plan to increase the kind of diversity, the chances of diversity going into outer space, going into the world. There's a chance to do a lot more to increase the prospects, the capabilities of human beings, and to take flight, in a manner of speaking. And I wanted to highlight the importance of broadening our horizons, studying science a little more, and the wonderful opportunities that Project Artemis hopefully will bring upon people. This constellation of Gemini right here, represented by the red and the yellow and the red and the blue, Pollux and Castor. In between them is the electromagnetic spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum is a series of energy frequencies that produce different sorts of lights. And because the human eye is so limited, only this little bit right here in the middle can actually be seen, and that is what we refer to as the human rainbow, the light of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv. Out of all these different frequencies, only this little bit right here is what we can see. There is so much more that is out there that the human eye just can't see because of a very fragile, very limited worldview and a very small perspective. I think that's wonderful, a little terrifying, but it's wonderful to get the perspective of several different colors that are completely invisible to the human eye. There's so much more than the limited human experience, and the idea of something greater than what is, hopefully, is encapsulated by this collection of works. This, I think, feeds naturally off of that. This is the hydrogen bond. And this was done after a little bit of research on DNA, and it came out of a period of my life where I was especially questioning the religion in my life, and what I was taught in school, in science, and in research papers was not aligning whatsoever with what was being taught in the world of religion. There was a dissonance there, and I wanted to close the gap. I was hoping for some way for the want for something more, the want for something spiritual could potentially overlap with scientific studies, scientific findings, and I figured if no one else was going to try to bridge religion and science in a way that made sense, maybe you'd hear a little more to science, but in a way that was still fulfilling to me as an individual and what I would like to believe, then I should perhaps fill in the blank myself. This was an intensive 19-month effort on my part, on and off. The numbers are a little hazy, but what it means is that DNA, the nitrogen bases, are made up of the same 4 compounds: adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. And similarly, all life arises from the same 6 chemicals: carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphate, and sulfur. Every living being, no matter a human or an animal or anything, no matter how small, how microscopic, how large, how unpredictable, how different from the human experience, shares those same 6 elements and those same 4 nitrogen bases. That's all we are. And for some reason, we find reason to have discussions on how to, despite all the discussion, all the potential for communication, connection, and growth, there are ways that we find ways to divide, to hate, to have malice, to commit acts of atrocity, to commit war on each other. And it's a worldview that I think can be progressed away from. I wanted to have an angle right here between the creation of man, front and center, God's wing, and then the biblical serpent right here, who has just been created and is both envious of the humans and is envious of God, for the humans worship God and not for himself, and therefore this is the blinding moment of the serpent has been created and is in unfathomable pain that it's being ignored. And I think that most evidence, most science, most logic, it all kind of has a way of being undone by little moments of pain and emotional confusion, and that is where the intrinsic bad separates us from everything that the human experience has in common, if that makes sense in a manner of speaking. The last artwork is this one right here in the invitation, and I saved him specifically for last. I've been talking in big concepts the whole time, and I want to narrow it down to the idea of shared experiences, something that's maybe a little more human. And Congo the chimpanzee is living proof of that. He was born in 1945, and at the age of 2, his zookeeper, caretaker, and artist and author Desmond Morris gave him gave him a piece of paper and gave him some pencils and some paintings and stuff. And what happened was, at first, he created all kinds of different marks, different messes and stuff. It was very inarticulate, as you might expect a monkey to paint. But over time, Congo developed certain likenesses to the way that humans perceive art. For one thing, Congo had an amazing sense of symmetry. If you marked up one side of the canvas, he would deliberately mark up the other to maintain a kind of balance, a kind of separation. But it's telling, and it speaks a lot to the way that humans, the way that primates think, is not so different. Primates are capable of a lot more things. They are capable of recognizing color. If you gave him blue, then he would also use blue. He would also use similar colors complementing on the color wheel: greens, yellows, purples, you name it, he would use it. And it's because humans and primates share so much in the same vein of thinking. They can be taught to recognize the musical octave. They can be taught to recognize they can be taught to pass the mirror test after enough training. They can be taught to think like humans in a lot of different ways. But there's one moment in a painting circa 1957 where he made an intentional decision. He was doing his usual process of marking up the canvas all over, and then he's very specifically went out of his way to make one dot in particular. And that was a moment that tells a lot about developmental psychology in both humans and in primates. There was this one moment of clarity where he thought it was very intentional to make a very specific mark that was separate from himself. He was not just making a mess for the sake of making a mess. He made a very specific aesthetic decision because he knew that was separate from himself. That was separate from the ego. That was a completely unrelated thing. And it was this moment where this poor little monkey right here, simple, happy, doing his own thing, had this moment of untapped fire, creation, brilliance. I wouldn't know what to call it, but something about the way that this mark is made speaks to a higher understanding that this monkey achieved completely on its own. And I think that that's telling. I think it tells a lot about the shared connections that we all have as humans, as forms of life. No matter what, there is so much that all people, all life forms, all living things, all of everything have in common, and yet it seems to be overdone, overlooked. So hopefully there's some way that art can bridge us all together despite the miscommunications. And if it's not possible for anything like a peaceful world, we can strive for more peace in said world. Thank you.
Thank you. Woo! Bravo.
Thank you very much. Thank you.